I would like to introduce Dr. Ellen Vorenkamp. She's a seasoned expert in balanced assessment systems, the formative assessment process, student engagement, the development of high-quality summative assessments, and the implementation of a guaranteed and viable curriculum. With more than 25 years of consulting experience, she's dedicated her career to helping educators build assessment literacy and implement practices that promote equitable student learning. Her work includes the design of professional learning resources, such as facilitation guides, learning tools, and articles. In addition to her consulting, Ellen's career has spanned classroom teaching, school administration, curriculum leadership, and service as an assessment consultant at Wayne Risa. As a leader with the Michigan Assessment Consortium, she's coordinated numerous professional learning opportunities and statewide programs that guide educators in integrating balanced assessment practices into everyday instruction. Ellen is also a lead for the Formative Assessment for Michigan Educators FAME initiative and is widely recognized for her practical insights and ability to bridge theory with classroom practice. Her presentations at the state and national conferences highlight her commitment to advancing assessment literacy and equity in education. Dedicated to balanced and thoughtful assessment practices, she's a valued contributor to any advisory group or professional community focused on improving educational outcomes for all students. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Ellen Vorenkamp.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to come and speak with you guys this morning. As Michelle said, I'll be here for 4 sessions, right? So I get the opportunity to start with you today around this assessment literacy journey and continue it over the next couple of months over the course of the year. So I'm really excited, and we're going to delve just a little bit deeper into all this assessment literacy and how it fits within a balanced assessment system, how it connects to, in particular, your Essential 9, when thinking about formative assessment and the formative assessment practices and those observations that you make along the way that let you know where the students are at and that good teaching and learning that's going on in your classrooms and with your coaches, coachees, and finding out where the kids are at so that you can do the targeted focused relearning that you might need to within your classrooms. So we're just going to get started, and we'll get as far as we get, and we can continue next time if we don't complete our 75 minutes together. So this is my agenda for today, and it's kind of woven in throughout all of the different activities and information that I'm going to share with you. I'd like to introduce you to the Michigan Assessment Consortium, or the MAC. Many of you might not know who we are or what we do. And then we're just going to talk a little bit about the what and why of a balanced assessment system, how assessment literacy supports that, what you can do from your leadership role to support that balanced assessment system within the classrooms that you get to visit and the teachers that you get to work with. We're going to concentrate on the piece that we believe brings balance to our assessment systems, which is formative assessment, and thinking about formative assessment as a process within the larger ecosystem of a balanced assessment system. And then thinking about that Essential 9, the inputs that help us with our outputs, and making sure that we are paying attention to those inputs, because that's where the magic happens. So that's kind of our goal for, again, our 75 minutes together. You do have all of these handouts in your agenda that Michelle referenced earlier. I also have a QR code there with a Google folder, just in case you like that better. But you have access to everything that you need for today, one way or the other. And then there are a couple of handouts on the table that we're going to be using as well. So just really quickly, who is the MAC? The MAC is an organization that was actually developed in 2008. So we have been around now for about 17 years. We are a nonprofit, and we work kind of in conjunction with the Michigan Department of Ed. We work very closely with OEAA and the Office of Assessment, so Andy Middlestead. While the state gets to concentrate on the state summative assessment, the MSTEP, the output, we get to help teachers across the state and across the nation actually think about the inputs, about the classroom level of assessment. What's happening at that classroom level that's going to give you the impact when you get to that MSTEP or you get to those NWEAs? What's happening in the classroom where we have control, the most control, and what are we doing well? And making sure that all of our teachers across the state of Michigan, all of our administrators across the state of Michigan, all of our policymakers across the state of Michigan are assessment literate. So in that picture, you might see some familiar faces. We have a wide variety of people who sit on our board and who participate in some of the activities that we do through professional learning, writing articles. We have a vast website that's got everything you could ever imagine around assessment put into words that we can understand. None of us are psychometricians. All of us are just passionate about making sure that the assessment that we do with our students is of high quality so that we're getting good information that we can help the students move themselves forward. Assessment literacy is our keystone. It's the foundation of which this organization is built. We feel very strongly that everybody within the organizations and educational systems need to have that assessment literacy. We think of assessment as a discipline. It has its own vocabulary, it has its own tenets, it has its own research, and we try to help you understand that you might be working with literacy in terms of reading, but we are working with literacy in terms of assessment because we know that teachers come to us without much preparation from our colleges of ed. We have been working our way in, but the real estate in our teacher prep programs is very tight. And trying to get a course on assessment literacy is quite difficult. So we do on-the-job training, right? We get into the schools, we get into the classrooms, and we build that assessment literacy or help deepen that assessment literacy as we move along. So in conjunction with that, one of the things that we have spent quite a bit of time, especially early on as we started to form our board and our organization, was the development of assessment literacy standards. So if we say everybody in the educational system needs to be assessment literate, what does that really mean? What does that mean we want them to believe? What does that mean we want them to understand? And what does that mean we want them to do or act upon when we think about assessment literacy? So on your tables, you have this brochure. So if you want to grab a copy of it, that would be great. You'll note that it is actually divided into several sections, sorry. There is one for students and their families, and that is divided into two. So what do elementary student teachers need to know? What do elementary students need to know and their families need to know, understand, and believe about assessment? What do secondary students need to know, understand, and do about assessment? What do teachers need to know, understand, believe about assessment, and do? And then what do building administrators, district administrators, and then local and state policies? We spent a lot of time developing this document, and we had it reviewed by people in the world. So people like Margaret Heritage, Rick Stiggins, Jim Popham, James Pellegrino, Susan Brookhart, all of the friends of MAC and all of the people who do a lot of assessment work across the United States have had their eyes on this. Without a doubt, they all told us that there's too many, that there's way too many, and we agreed with that. But when we went to try to cull and say what wasn't important, we couldn't because they're all important. They might be different levels of importance at different times within your understanding around assessment and assessment literacy. So we're going to actually just delve into this for a few minutes, and we're going to just do a quick activity. So if you're on a remote site, you have access to this document through the QR code or through the agenda. You also have access to a second one that's a little bit truncated. So what I did is I just pulled out the pages that had to do with students, both elementary and secondary, and with the teachers. So in your agenda, it might be handout 1 or handout 1A. So what I'd like you to do, if you have the actual document in front of you, like you guys here in Saginaw, figure out what you want to examine. Do you want to look at elementary students? Do you want to look at secondary students, or would you rather look at the teachers? And the reason that I included the student piece is because a couple of years ago, back in like 2018, I had the opportunity to meet with Dylan Willem, who is an international expert in assessment and assessment practices. And I asked him, what's the best way to help teachers become more assessment literate? And his answer was, help them help their students to become more assessment literate. So when we think about what students have to do, that then kind of helps us think about what teachers need to do in order to make sure that they and their students are assessment literate. So what I'm going to have you do is use two different highlighters or two different symbols and either look over the elementary students, if that's where your primary work is, the secondary students, or if you'd like to just focus in on the teacher one, that's fine. And just kind of go through and think about all of the people that you interact with or all of the students that you see in classrooms. And look at those different dispositions, look at those different pieces of knowledge that they need to do and the actions that they need to engage in. What are the ones that you see a lot of that you think those teachers or those students are pretty well versed in, that they have that literacy that they need in order to be successful? And what are the ones that they might need a little bit of help with? So either color code it 2 different colors if you have highlighters, or you could use 2 different symbols like a check mark for those that you think that they're doing well, and an exclamation point where we might need to learn a little bit more about that. Hopefully from this, you're recognizing that there's a lot more involved in thinking about assessment literacy than just some of the simple things that we might, like the difference between a percentage and a percentile, the difference between norm reference and criterion reference, the difference between, why did my kids do well on the M step, but they're not doing well on the NWA, or why didn't they do well on the M step, but they're doing great on NWA? Different purposes, different pieces of information. And just kind of realizing that there is a whole lot out there when you start to think about assessment literacy and making sure that teachers understand that. The simple fact of, formative assessments, there is no such thing as a formative assessment. It's not the tool that you're using, it's what you're doing with the information from the tool and the evidence that you're getting. That there's a difference between testing and assessment, that there's a difference between evidence and data. That there's a lot out there that teachers need to know and understand when we have these conversations about our students and when we lean into Essential 9 and we start to think about how we are assessing those kids and getting that good information. That it doesn't always have to be a paper pencil, that it could be a conversation, it can be an observation, it can be much more than a multiple choice test that we see in a lot of the classrooms, at least where I visit. So hopefully you're noticing some things, and we're here to help you kind of get a better understanding of all that so that you can go back into those classrooms and help the coaches who can then help the students so that we can start to build that assessment literacy that we need. When you think about this statistic, it's pretty stark. Rick Stiggins says that about 80% of a student's assessment experience is determined by us. It's not the M-STEP, it's not the MWEA, it's what we are doing on a daily basis in our classrooms. And Rick Stiggins also says that teachers spend about 85% of your time engaged in assessment. It might not be a formal test, but you are engaged in assessment because you are asking questions, you're getting evidence, you're providing the kids tasks and activities and projects and things that you want them to do, you're collecting evidence. So based on that evidence, it's giving you information around what students know, what they don't know, where they need to go next in their learning, and all of it is just as valid as an NWA or an iReady score or the M-STEP score. In fact, it's probably more valuable because it's more directly related to you and your students and what's happening in that moment. So we have to recognize that that information is valuable. We have to elevate it. We also need to ensure that the tools that we're using to get that information are of high quality. Because otherwise, I always lean into that statement, garbage in, garbage out, right? And we don't want to make decisions about kids based on garbage. We want to make sure that they're reliable tools, that they're giving us valid information so that we can make valid decisions about what kids know and where they're at. So when we think about that, again, that's the mission of the MAC, is to help teachers recognize this, to help students and parents recognize this, to help administrators. And you guys, we are working on the legislature, believe me. Unfortunately, the turnover is so fast that just as soon as we get somebody where we need them, they're term limited and we have to start all over again, but we are working on it. So when I think about a balanced assessment system, which all of these assessment literacy standards support, this is kind of the quote that we like to use. It says, "A collection of assessment does not entail a system any more than a pile of bricks constitutes a house." And oftentimes what we find when we go into particular districts is just a lot of testing, just a whole lot of testing. It's like if I were going on a diet and I wanted to lose weight and I bought a scale, but I didn't like what that scale told me, I went and bought another scale. And it's telling me the exact same thing. I don't like that one, so I'm going to go buy another and another and another. And I'm looking for the quick fix. But the quick fix isn't another test. The quick fix is wondering, what's the input, right? What's the input to that number that I see on that scale? What's the exercise? What's the food that I'm eating? What's the sleep that I'm getting? What's the stress that I'm under? What are the inputs that are giving me that output? We can't keep over-testing but under-assessing our students. We have to do more around the assessment piece. And it has to be intentional and it has to be purposeful because we don't want to have these redundancies in our assessment systems that are giving us the exact same information and yet losing other pieces of really important information and evidence that need to be elevated. So this is a definition. I'll give you just a moment to read this. Couple of key ideas. One assessment might be good for one purpose, totally inappropriate for another. But that one purpose might be something that we don't need, but somebody else in the system does. So we have to think about who's using the information and what information those people need in order to make the decisions that they're responsible for. So we recognize now that we need a balanced assessment system, but we need to make sure that we have all the pieces and parts that are required and that we're not being redundant, right? So let me give you an example of what this looks like. When we think about a balanced assessment system, we tend to think of 3 big C's, is what we like to call them. We want to make sure that the assessment system is comprehensive. We want to make sure that it's continuous, and we want to make sure that it's coherent. So when we think about comprehensive, we recognize that we use a variety of tools and practices, that we honor both assessment for learning, which would be our assessment, formative assessment pieces and practices and process, and assessment of learning, because we know that we're never going to get away from the M-step. It's codified by law. We have to do it, and people need that information, just like they need information from our interim benchmarks. But so do students need information about what they did yesterday and how it's going to impact what they do tomorrow when we get back into those classrooms. We know that assessments collectively meet all the purpose for assessment and all the needs of all the users within the assessment system. But most importantly, we need to understand that students have to be engaged in this process. That students have to recognize that assessment is not something that is only done to them, but it should be something that is done with them. If you look at the actual definition of assessment, the root word assidere comes from the Greek or Roman, I can never remember, I think it's Greek, assidere, which means to sit beside. So when we think about true assessment, it's about sitting beside the student, helping them understand what they're really strong on and where they need to go next to continue to build that learning process. Think about Tier 1 MTSS. This is complete Tier 1 MTSS when you start to think about assessment in that way. Not when I start to think about testing, that is not MTSS Tier 1. But when I think about assessment, in particular formative assessment, that we're going to get a little bit more into here in a few minutes. So comprehensive means all of these things. We represent it with this graphic. This is what we like to think of when we think about a balanced assessment system. We have an inverted triangle, and we put the classroom level up at the top. It's the biggest, it's the deepest, it's the one that should be most important. And yeah, when I get called in, when I worked at Wayne Risa, shout out to my Wayne Risa friends, when I worked at Wayne Risa and I would get calls from districts, it never was classroom assessment that I was asked to look for or to look at. It was always around the M-step. It was always around and doing data digs around the output. I didn't care about the output as much. I wanted to care about the input because it's the input that's going to change the output, not just looking at the scores. So when I look at this triangle, I recognize that somebody at the state needs the M-step. Andy Middlestead, who is our director of assessment, cannot be in every third grade classroom across the state. He just can't. So we have to have some sort of standard that we're holding those third grade teachers to and making sure that all of those teachers are working towards that standard that the M-step represents in terms of student learning. And we can use it then for things like accountability. We can use it to evaluate learning at a very high level. We can use it to think about some of our practices at a district-wide or a school-wide level. But to use it to try to figure out where Melissa is today, To think about where she needs to go tomorrow is totally inappropriate. In fact, oftentimes teachers will come up to Andy and say, why do we give this? It doesn't help me in my teaching at all. It's not for you. It's not for that purpose. It's for the state. It's for your administrators. It's for bigger issues that are outside the students sitting in your classroom. Return to Learn Law, everybody needed to have an interim benchmark assessment. Again, good information. We get it 3 times a year. We use a tool that is sort of aligned with our state standards, giving us some information about what our students know and are able to do. Most of them are normed referenced, right? So the kids might do really well depending on who else is in their group. Remember that the M-STEP is criterion referenced. We have a state, it has to be this high. This is what the kids have to meet in order to be successful. So oftentimes, depending on how the kids and who the kids are being normed against, they might do very well on the iReady or the M-STEP or the NWA, but still fail the M-STEP because the norming group might change, right? Just like we could get into a line here and we could have our norm in terms of height, and the people in the middle and all the ones that are higher would all be proficient. And yet if we had the entire Pistons team come in and stand, we would all of a sudden not be proficient because we now have a whole bunch of tall people in the building, right? So when you think about norms, you have to think about your group. Again, good information, right? We can use things like those interim benchmarks to think about predicting performance. Typically, kids who do well on the NWAs, iReadys, whatever, Star Renaissance, do fairly well on an M-STEP because they can read, right? And that's where you guys come in because they're all reading tests, right? It's really important. We can use them to evaluate curricular programs. We can use them to inform services. We can think about placement if we need to. If we have a student that's falling too far behind too fast, we can think about intervention, so on and so forth. But the one that has the most value and the one that we as educators have the most control over is the purple. It's what we're doing on a daily basis, minute by minute, 185 days a year in our classrooms with our students. It's the one that we use to monitor and adjust. It's the one we use to inform students and parents about where they're at, what they've got, where they need to go to next. We can make sure that it's directly aligned with our state standards, and we can make sure that it has a representation of the impact that our teaching is having on our students. So it is the one that's most important. It's interesting. I have heard that we spend as a nation on the orange and green about $7 billion a year. In all of the things that go into all of the nationalized, standardized testing. $7 billion a year to get about 20% of the information on who our students are. If you were to create portraits of all of the kids, like actual portraits of all of the kids that are graduating from your individual school districts, because you want to hang them on Main Street, and you only use 20% of the pixels that you needed to create those pictures, to create those portraits, you wouldn't be able to tell one kid from the next as the parents and kids are walking down Main Street. The other 80% comes from the purple. And we as a nation do not spend anywhere near $7 billion a year trying to help our teachers become more assessment literate so that they can do a better job of impacting that classroom level of assessment. You're lucky that you live in Michigan because at least the Michigan Department of Ed has set aside approximately $2 million a year to really help teachers with this work. And we also have the math that is doing this work. The MDE is through the FAME program, the Formative Assessment through Michigan Educators. So comprehensive is key. The next one was continuous. When we think about continuous, we think about all elements of an assessment system coming together and coordinating. And when I think about this one, I think about Dr. Fox-Resnick, and when she was talking about one of the big ideas or the thinking traps in terms of silos, it's not about any one of these, it's about all of these. It's about all of these coming together and working together and providing that coherence. So a coherence, making sure that everything is thinking about the same content and that we're all headed in the same direction, that the curriculum that we use, the assessment that we use, the instruction pieces that we use, the professional learning that we use, I'm going to put it out there, the grading practices that we use are all about supporting children, not just about reporting, right? We want to make sure that we're supporting. So this is the representation that we use, and you'll notice that it's color-coded the same as the triangle. right? We have clarity here in the state of Michigan. We know exactly what our job is as educators. We know that we have these Michigan Career and College Readiness Standards, and we know at the end of any given learning opportunity, 3 through 8th grade and 11th grade in math and ELA and science and social studies occasionally, the state's going to hold us accountable for whether or not we get the students there. So we know our beginning, we know our end. We need to make sure that the things in the middle are coherent and that they are aligned and that they are helping us get from point A to point B. And then underneath it, all of those things that we decide are important, the curriculum, the instructional practices, the grading and reporting, all of our school initiatives, professional learning, all of that needs to be aligned. If one piece of that is not aligned, then we're making our job much harder. And typically, the one that's not aligned are the purple. Because oftentimes we have teachers who aren't clear about what it is they need to be teaching. And if they do have clarity in terms of the content, they're not always sure about the rigor and how rigorous it needs to be. I could go into a building with 3 or 4 fourth grade teachers and get a completely different performance level for all 4 of those teachers in those classrooms in terms of what their expectations are for students to achieve in 4th grade. Because what is grade level expectation? It's a hard answer. It's a hard question to answer. It takes time. It takes collaboration. So then the last one is continuous. And this just means that we don't wait till the end to test our kids. We continually assess during. As we're teaching and learning, we are curious as educators about whether or not our instruction has been impactful, and we continually to gather evidence to determine if they're all on the right track. And then we make sure that students are a part of this process. And that happens at this level. It doesn't happen with an NWA, it doesn't happen with the M-STEP, but it can happen with every assignment, every question, every task that you ask and engage the kids in throughout that teaching and learning process, both through the formative and through high quality summative. I have been in rooms where the formative assessment process is going really, really well and things are swimming. And then all of a sudden there's a summative test that ruins everything. And the kids all of a sudden come away with that teaching and learning with a bad taste in their mouth because the test didn't assess what they were actually had been learning. It wasn't at the right rigor. It was too easy. It was too hard. Kids get this feeling, then all of a sudden they start to lose their confidence. They're not as competent at feeling anymore. And pretty soon they're disengaged and unmotivated and they drop out. 29.4 of our kids across the Michigan are chronically absent. That's huge. I was at a meeting a couple of days ago where one of the superintendents from an ISD, I think it was a small ISD, but still, said their second largest district in their region, in their ISD, was homeschooling. Numbers in our alternative schools are going up. We have to do something different. And I believe the assessment and the way that we assess our kids can be a part of that. And when we think about balance, it's not about 50-50 summative formative. It's about formative. It's about really elevating that during the learning and getting a real clear understanding of where kids are at during the teaching and learning and giving them the opportunity to have that understanding as well so that both halves of the classroom can work together to move the students forward. So assessment for learning is what we need in our classrooms to bring in the balance. I already told you about that, so I can skip through that part. In your agenda or online in that QR code, there is an example of one district that has been developing a balanced assessment system. And they actually have a board adopted definition of what a balanced assessment system looks like. And they've created this graphic that they are living into in terms of being very purposeful and intentional about what assessments they are giving and how they're giving them, who's using the information and for what purpose. This is an ideal that we would like to get to in every district. This is kind of a unicorn, which is, by the way, the national animal of Scotland, in case any of you didn't know that. But this is what we're working towards, a balanced assessment system. I drink a lot of Snapple, and that was on Snapple lid. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to look this over and just talk about what you're noticing. Just pull it up with a colleague, see what you see. What are you noticing about how they are balancing and thinking about elevating that formative assessment piece. You'll notice it's also color-coded in relation to that triangle, and that the purple part is the biggest part, because that's where 80% of our information comes from. So I'll give you a couple minutes just to review and look over. So a couple of comments here in Saginaw as I was walking around a little bit. One of them, I'd like to make distinction between evidence and data. When I think of data, I think of a score. I think of a number. I think of the orange and the green. That's good. That tells us something, especially when we have trend data over several years or several months, giving us some information about, patterns and, trends. But I also think of data as the output, the final. So when I think about evidence, I think about the classroom level, because with evidence, you can still do something with it. You can still look for the whys and behind it. So you can still kind of figure out, the context, right? And you can do something about it. When I was doing a workshop right around March last year, the Final Four, and all of the madness, March Madness, and I kept thinking of all the teams that lost, especially Baylor. I'm a huge Baylor fan. But anyway, all the teams that lost. And I realized the coaches, they don't go back and look at the score. They go back and look at the tapes to find out what created that score, or they should, right? The Lions this past Sunday, they know what the score is. But what they need to do, and what I know, is look at the tapes to find out what went into that score to make sure that they can do better next time. That's what evidence can do. So when you're doing your coaching cycles and you're worrying about NWA or already or IMS, is that the best data to be looking at? Or should you be looking at the evidence? Should you be bringing assignments that the kids have done, tasks that the kids have done to the table and saying, what was it that you were asking the kids to know and be able to do? What does this child know? Based on what you wanted them to, what don't they know? How are you going to move them forward? Because you want to do it in the moment. Because once that moment is gone, trying to get it back, it's hard. Jerome Bruner, who is a child psychologist from the UK, had a great quote. Write this one down. Good teaching is forever being on the cutting edge of a child's competence. Good teaching is forever being on the cutting edge of a child's competence. But if we don't know where that competence is, then how can we ensure that we are nudging that child along? How can we ensure that we are moving them and not pushing them? We don't want to push them over the edge. We want to nudge gently. We need evidence to find out where they're at. Not necessarily data, evidence. You will also note that I haven't said the word worksheet, classwork, or homework, because I try very hard not to. I try very hard to think of it as assignments, tasks, engagements, projects, centers, because no kid wants to do homework, classwork, worksheets, blah, blah. I don't want to do them. I don't even want to print them anymore, right? All right, so what can you guys do? What can you guys do as leaders to support? Well, when you think about barriers to a balanced assessment system, there are 4 big ones, and actually they've come up with a new article that actually identifies 7, but I haven't yet added that to my slide because it just came out this week. But the one that I care the most about is number 3. It's a lack of assessment literacy. It's a lack around the specificity of the discipline of assessment and the terminology that we use and the big practices that we live into, the literacy standards that we are engaging in. We want to make sure that we build the assessment literacy, because otherwise people don't even know that it matters. People really don't know that assessment systems matter. They think if they can change the curriculum or change the resource or change... But if you don't have good assessment, especially during the learning, and you're trying to do an intervention, what do you tell the interventionists when they come to get the kids? Take them out in the hall, talk slower and louder. Maybe they'll get it. You want to be very specific, right? The child needs help with this because they understand this, they need to get to, and this is the pathway. Assessment systems are huge because in reality, they underlie everything. It's not about just teaching and learning. It's about teaching, learning, and assessing. And they're all integrated. So think about your barriers. Think about these big ideas that you were introduced to with Dr. Fox-Resnick. And really think about number 6 was the one that I was really kind of thinking about. This isn't about short bursts of sitting down and learning about assessment literacy, and this isn't siloed. This is good teaching and learning. And there needs to be a consistent, focused understanding and development around assessment literacy with your folks. If you guys become more assessment literate, you help the teachers become more assessment literate, they help the students become more assessment literate, then eventually it's going to work its way up because you will have started that fire, you're building that capacity that you need. Why is it important? I think I just made that point. Because it undergirds everything that we do within our educational system. We know that we need a variety of purposes. We need a variety of people engaged in those purposes. We need the big picture. We need all the pixels so that we can really make sure that we're producing the graduates that we want to from our systems. This is just a different representation. This comes from our ELAS guide that we'll explain to you a little bit more later on in this series. Some people need it for accountability. Some people need it for evaluation. Some people need it for program development. Some people need it for screening, diagnostic, instructional planning, progress monitoring. All of those pieces and parts are important, but you can't use an M-STEP score for all of it. There has to be other pieces of information, evidence, and data. Another version with questions that you might like to lean into. This also comes from our ELAS guide that I'll explain to you a little bit more. I love this quote from Rick Stiggins. I am a firm Stiggonite. I don't know if anybody else in the room is, but this is a great quote, and I'll let you just read it. We can't expect kids to sit down for an NWA or an M-STEP with a, go do your best, when we've told them repeatedly that they suck, that they stink, that they can't, that they're not, that they're not, that they're not, by our assessment practices during the teaching and learning. And oftentimes that comes because of our grading practices as well. But I'm going to try very hard not to go there. Yeah, I know, right? All right. So how do we deepen our assessment literacy? We make time for professional development like this. You take this brochure back and you give it to your admin. You say, hey, maybe we could do some thinking around this. Maybe we could pinpoint in each of our professional learning opportunities which standards we're actually hitting, and we kind of just start to sneak them in, and we actually just start to help build that assessment literacy. We take the time. Because we're taking the time, we have to make the time, and we have to take advantage of these learning opportunities. We have to periodically consider whether learning is meeting our needs, and we need to continue to move the learning forward. In that vein, and I'm going to do just a quick commercial, I think it was emailed to you earlier, hopefully, and those of you that are in person, I do have a little postcard of some upcoming learning opportunities around this, and the one on the full side is the Assessment Learning Institute. If this is lighting a fire in any of you and you want to dig deeper, because we're going to go, but we're not going to get really deep because we only have an hour at each one of these sessions. If you really want to learn more, that Assessment Learning Institute, it does start this Saturday, and it says on your postcard in person from 9 to 3. We've actually changed that. It's going to be virtual, and it's going to be from 9 to 1. And if any of you are in a district with MEA as your union, they actually have some scholarships available that would cover the cost of the registration. It does not, unfortunately, cover the cost of your Saturday or the other 4 sessions that are 3 hours during the day. But maybe as coaches, if you don't have classrooms, you would need a sub, you might be able to come. So shameless plug. And then on the back side, there's a great book by Star Saxstein that we're going to do for our MAC rates. And then there's also an ALI alumni event. And one of our first ones is with Aaron Boffman from Michigan Virtual, talking about AI and how we can use and utilize AI ethically in our classrooms. So if you're interested in that, feel free to join us because you want to take advantage of these professional learning opportunities. I'm going to spend the last 7 plus 15, who does math really well, 22 minutes talking to you about formative assessment and the formative assessment process. And before we do that, I want to dip into your own funds of knowledge. I want to activate and engage your own prior knowledge around formative assessment. So I'm assuming all of you have a sheet of paper somewhere. And if not, the handout that you're going to be using later this afternoon that has the 3, 2, 1 is blank on the back. So you might take that and just flip it over. Or if you have some Post-it notes at your table, you could do that as well. And what I want you to do is this is a 3-step process. So we're kind of leaning into this thought of what am I going to learn? What do I need to relearn? And what do I need to unlearn when it comes to my thinking around formative assessment? So the first thing I want you to do is individually at your tables, just think, when you hear that word, formative assessment, what comes to mind? And I want you just to jot down some notes at the top of that paper. What words or phrases, what actions, what practices, what comes to mind when you hear formative assessment? So what I'd like you to do now is draw another line. So if you wrote anything between what you initially thought, and if you had some collaboration and together you came up with some additional ideas and thoughts, draw a second line and then leave some space at the bottom, because I'm going to go through a short direct instruction around how we here in the state of Michigan define formative assessment. And I want you to have some space for anything that might be new, any new ideas or thoughts that come to you from these next couple of slides. So we are concentrating on the formative piece. When you think about the key question to formative assessment, it's not, did the students learn it, yes or no? It's not, was my teaching as impactful, yes or no? It's not, should I grade it, yes or no? Because the answer is always no if it's formative. The question is, what comes next in the student's learning? Based on this evidence and where I knew my students need to go in terms of being proficient, where are they at now and what's that next step? In reality, to feel competent, that's all kids need. They need to know the destination, and they need to know where they're at and what next step they need to take in order to become proficient. We hold that key as educators, and we need to make it that transparent that every child knows, because learning is about mastery, not mystery, right? And it should not be shrouded. And it's also not about doing. So when I go into classrooms and I see workbook number 14, answer questions 1 through 5, read this text, answer questions 6 through 8, fine. That's what they're doing. What am I going to learn from that? You want me to do this, I'll say it, worksheet. What do you want me to learn from it? So if an administrator comes in and sits next to a kid and says, what are you learning? Or what are you doing? This worksheet. Yeah. No, I'm learning how to do 2-digit multiplication. And this is evidence that I'm providing my teacher so that they know where I'm at and where I need to go to next. Wouldn't that be lovely? I know it's a unicorn again, but actually there are districts that are really starting to push that. I think it's powerful. So here is a definition of the formative assessment process. This is the definition that we have adopted. It's been endorsed by our Michigan Department of Ed. It was developed by a team of educators from across multiple states. Give you a moment to read it. Think about a key word or phrase in there that you're noticing. Maybe jot it down. If it's something that you already had on your paper, maybe circle it. Maybe you're just relearning it, or maybe you already had it in your head. If it's a new word or thought, put it underneath the second line. And let's kind of dissect it. Maybe you said planned. That's kind of new in the research, but definitely formative assessment is planned. You have to have clarity in terms of what it is that you want the students to know. You have to have clarity in terms of what proficiency on that looks like. You have to have a clear plan of how you're going to instruct around it. You have to have a clear plan when you're going to stop and give the kids feedback, gather the evidence, clear plan when you might have them reflect on that evidence, because, self-assessment is huge, peer assessment is huge. It doesn't happen by happenstance. Jim Popham, who is just a Jim, very elderly at this point in time, but he used to say, I go into classrooms and teachers think thumbs up, thumbs down is a formative assessment. And it's like, well, it can be, but really all it's going to tell you is whether or not the kids have thumbs. And you probably already knew if you had a child in there that didn't have a thumb. And then he says, well, I also hear teachers say, well, I got that look. And he's like, it could be gas. Right? He's a funny guy, kind of like a little Elmer Fudd. I liked him a lot. But it's definitely planned. You think about what misconceptions might these kids have? What gaps might they have? I've taught this content for 15 years. If I don't know that yet, then I'm not doing a very good job. And you plan. And he would say, if plan A doesn't work, you go to plan B. And then you have plan C. And you have 26 letters in the alphabet. And then you can start to double up if you need to. You plan for it. He also says that it is a process. It is an ongoing process. It is minute by minute, day by day. And if you think about it, pretty much everything you do in your classroom is gathering evidence. And the rest of the time is analyzing it, interpreting it, and figuring out how you're going to give the kids feedback on it. Unless it's summative, in which case put a grade on it, put it in the grade book, move on. But if it's formative, then use it to form the learning, right? And that comes because it is a continual process of gathering evidence, analyzing, interpreting, giving feedback, gathering more evidence. The feedback that you give a kid today should not be the feedback you give them tomorrow, because they should know that step that they need, and they should have moved on, and you're going to be giving them new feedback, right? Susan Burkhart would say we give feedback to feed forward. Maybe you saw something in there about self-directed learners, wanting to make sure that the emphasis is on the learning and the teaching, right? Not on the doing, but on the learning and the teaching. I don't know this animation, sorry. It's about students and making sure that students are at the heart of this process. That again, that this assessment is done with them, right? And that they recognize that they're not going to be penalized. They're not going to be told that they can't the first time that they have ever tried and practiced. We're going to give them the opportunity to learn. We're not going to just keep rewarding the kids who learn quickly, but we're going to make sure that all kids get rewarded for their success and their movement. And disciplinary learning is huge. This is one thing that we've learned more in the research recently around formative assessment, that the better you understand your discipline, the better your teachers understand how kids learn how to read, and the better they understand the pedagogy behind it in terms of how to teach it, the better off the formative assessment process will be. We also know, though, that teachers who don't have that strong background or that strong pedagogy, if they break it down, the formative assessment process, into its components and its elements, they actually get better and actually begin to learn their discipline a lot more quickly. So it's kind of a reciprocal relationship. And ultimately, the goal is to have self-directed learners. Kids who recognize that learning is a journey, that sometimes it takes some practice, that sometimes it takes a failure or two to learn from that mistake, and that's okay. We're not going to be penalized. We're not going to be shunned. We're going to just be able to continue to move ourselves forward, because I know what the trajectory is. I know what that next step is. Guiding questions probably look familiar. The DeFores use these in terms of their PLCs, but they were actually developed by Roy Sadler, actually in relation to reading, wanting students to have that clarity in terms of where are we going, where are we now, and how do we close that gap. When we think about it in the formative assessment world, we think about this, a GPS system, right? All of us knew exactly where we needed to be today. We knew we needed to be at 7400, Bay Road, Saginaw, what is this, Collins Hall, Curtis Hall. Those of you who are in outside places, you knew exactly where you needed to be. You knew your success criteria. You needed to be here at a certain time. You needed to have certain things with you. You needed to have an open mind. You needed to have a pen, right? And yet we all came in different directions. We all came in different vehicles. We all arrived at different times, but we're all here. And I may have come the furthest. I don't know. I came from the Pinckney area, and I'm getting on the highway, and I put my GPS on, right? Because I pretty much know how to go straight up 23. But once where do I get off? And if there had been a roadblock, or if there had been an accident and I had taken a wrong turn, or I'd gotten to a roundabout and decided just to do a bunch of little wheelies in the middle of it, What would my GPS system have done? Recalculated, redirected, got me back on target. Our teachers and these assessment pieces, these formative pieces, are the satellite that help the kids redirect, that keep them on track. They might take different paths and they might get there at different times, but they're all going to get there, especially on those most important things. We do not wait until the end to find out that half our kids are on that roundabout and going in circles. We need the evidence along the way. That's your essential 9. Lives into your essential 3. Big ideas that I've already talked about. It's an approach to instruction that embeds assessment within that teaching and learning process. Formative assessment is planned. It occurs during the learning cycle. It places students and student understanding at the center. We gather evidence. We make sure we have quality evidence. And we gather that evidence during the learning. We don't wait till the end. We make sure that the evidence that we collect is analyzed, it's interpreted, and it's acted upon. And in most ways, that's through feedback. Not scores, not numbers, not symbols, but words. Words that help move the students forward. Because I'm telling you, a C+ on a paper doesn't tell a kid much of anything. Tells them they got something good. They did something well enough to get a C+, but they don't know what it is, so trying to replicate it might be hard. It doesn't tell them why they didn't get an A. Good luck trying to guess. But words, and it doesn't have to be individual words on every child. It could be something as simple as, I looked at your evidence last night, and based on that, this is what I saw. And you could name what you saw that was positive, and you know what? We still need to work on this, so we're going to do this mini lesson. Or this group, you guys did really, really well, so you're going to go do this center. You guys didn't do so well, you're going to go do this center. You guys, you need a little bit more help, you're going to work with me. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you can get that information and that you can use it to adjust. And that's what you do. You adjust. You adjust your teaching to make sure that you're hitting the needs of all the kids, and you help them adjust as well. Because maybe it was just one little tweak. Maybe it's just one little strategy that they forgot how to use. Maybe it was just one little gap that they need to have filled in. We know that disciplinary knowledge is important. We know that the pedagogical knowledge is important. And the last one, number 9, is probably the most important. It has to be within a low-stakes environment. We have to make sure that kids recognize that learning is a journey and that mistakes are meant to be made and to learn from them, and that failure is an option, but not dwelling on that failure, recovering from that failure and moving on. And it's really about nudging. It's about nudging the students along. If we can elevate this and use this evidence, then we're going to create more balance within our assessment systems. We are not making everything within our classrooms summative. We're not putting a grade and an evaluation and a judgment. We are using the evidence to nudge. There are a lot of benefits for formative assessment. It really provides that immediate targeted feedback that kids need to move themselves forward. It supports personalized instruction, right, by addressing each child. It enhances student motivation and engagement because they're not being told they can't the first time again that they may have tried. If I had been evaluated the first time I ever drove a car and subsequent wrecks between now and then, I still wouldn't have a driver's license if you averaged it all together, because I've totaled a couple of cars. Not all my fault, but if you see me on the freeway, you might want to move over. It helps identify misconceptions and gaps in understanding, encourages a growth mindset, helps build the confidence of the kids, the competence of them, gives them a little bit of control, gives them a little bit of choice, makes it a little bit more relatable. It's just an approach that really helps grow achievement. Because in reality, if you were to take your phone and you were to Google summative assessment equals student achievement, you won't find it. There's no research that says having kids do the SATs, the PSATs, the SATs, the NWAs, all the alphabet soup of high-stakes summative assessment. There's nothing that says it helps with achievement because it's not their purpose. Their purpose is not to grow achievement. Their purpose is to report achievement. If you want to impact achievement, you have to go to the formative assessment piece because that's where there are over 8,000 studies around the importance of the formative assessment process. there's a link between the formative and the summative. And if you really want the kids to do better on the summative assessment, the output, pay attention to the formative input, and the kids will improve. You will see achievement, you will see growth, which is what this is really all about. All right. What it is not. And you might want to add any of this to your handout real quick before you give you a moment to look it over. What it is not. It is not any activity, assessment, or evaluation that does not intend to inform, guide, or adjust. It's not a shorter quiz. It's not a test. It's not even an exit ticket if you don't do anything with the exit ticket. The only way an exit ticket is formative is if you look at them and decide, don't put a grade on it. Don't let it sit on your desk for a couple of weeks, right? Let's see. It is not a high-stake interim benchmark. Some of our NWAs and iReady used to actually market themselves as formative. They are not. They are summative, right? You might use them to inform, but that is not the same as the formative assessment process. They are not one-time assignments that are completed, graded, and moved back, and they are not activities lacking adaptation regardless of student performance and outcomes. Those are typically very summative in nature. So take a minute, look back at your sheet. What might you have added from those few slides around what formative assessment is and is not? And I'm going to give you just 1 minute, and then I'm going to skip ahead to just one final reflection. And this is your reflection. So pick one. Pick one that you want to answer. Find a Post-it note, and we'll collect them and see the impact of what we had, because I can use this as formative feedback for me. By the way, that activity that we did around what you already know, what you learned from a partner, what you learned from some directives, that's a formative assessment. If I collected all those, it would give me some information around what was working, what wasn't working, what I might do next time we're together. But I'm not going to collect those. I will collect the Post-it note. And thank you guys very much. I appreciate your time and attention.